Everyone thinks the Great Depression killed tariffs, that the world collapsed in 1929, and by some economic gravity, protectionism simply withered away. But what if that's not true? What if tariffs in America, once the backbone of U.S. government income and the wall that shielded its infant industries, weren't ended by economists or politicians, but by a courtroom ambush? Not in Congress, not in the White House, but in a lawsuit quietly filed in 1930, just months after the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff was signed into law. And here's the real twist. The people who destroyed America's tariff system didn't hate protectionism on moral grounds. They just hated what it did to credit markets. Because if you control capital, you don't need borders. You want open trade, cheap imports, predictable laws, not rising wages, not national industries. You want access. That legal case, U.S. versus Hanson Importing Co, was one of the earliest cracks. By the time Roosevelt's New Deal came in, tariffs were already being hollowed out by procedural rulings, valuation standards, and a clever weapon called the Tariff Commission, whose job was supposedly to protect America, but whose decisions, line by line, rewrote the game in favor of banks and importers. Fast forward nearly a century. In 2025, Donald Trump returns to office, and immediately he brings back what he tried in 2018: steep tariffs, blanket national security claims, direct executive control over trade. The media says it's reckless, populist, even illegal. But Trump doesn't care, because something happened while he was gone. In his first term, the courts let him impose tariffs under Section 232. But by 2022, a series of rulings, led by Trans-Pacific Steel versus United States, began to unravel that power. Quietly, legally, the same way they did in 1930. So the battle wasn't just about China, or even steel. It was about whether the president, any president, could still use tariffs as a weapon of sovereignty, or whether that power had already been outsourced decades ago to courts, agencies, and multinational lenders. Because tariffs are not just taxes, they are economic borders, and without borders, capital moves faster than nations can defend. If this already flipped a switch in your view of history, drop a comment where you're watching from. The fight that shaped America's economy didn't start with Trump. It started with a court case and a trap. To understand how tariffs were hollowed out not by debate, but by design, we need to go back, not to the 1930s, but to the world before income tax. Because before 1913, tariffs weren't a policy, they were survival. The U.S. federal government, for most of its early life, had only one real source of income: customs duties. Every ship that docked, every crate unloaded, that was tax revenue. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, 95% of all federal income came from tariffs. Not some of it, almost all of it. Tariffs were the state. But they weren't just financial, they were ideological. From Alexander Hamilton to Henry Clay, protectionism wasn't a reaction, it was the blueprint. The U.S. was never supposed to be a free trading empire like Britain. It was supposed to be the opposite, a young industrial republic that nurtured its factories with high walls. Britain sold textiles, America raised tariffs. Britain dumped steel, America raised tariffs. Every time capital tried to flood in, America shut the gates. It worked, for a while. From 1865 to 1913, under the so-called Republican tariff consensus, the U.S. became the most protected large economy in the world. And industry exploded. By 1900, America had passed Britain in total manufacturing output. But something else had been growing behind the walls: banking power. And banks didn't like tariffs. Tariffs slowed down trade flows. They created uncertainty. Worse, they put power in the hands of politicians. One Congress could raise duties, the next could slash them. Markets hate that. Creditors hate that even more. So a quiet counter-system began to form, not in parliaments, but in courts, commissions, and trade agreements. In 1909, President Taft, a lawyer by training and no fan of tariff politics, signed a law that barely made headlines, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. It looked like a simple rebalancing of rates, but buried inside was something called the Tariff Board, the ancestor of the modern U.S. Tariff Commission. Its purpose? To take the politics out of tariffs. In other words, take power away from Congress and give it to experts. The idea was seductive: objective economic data, scientific tariff setting, no more populist interference. But here's the catch. Once you hand technical authority to a board, you shift the battlefield. Tariffs are no longer decided by voters. They're decided by procedures, calculations, legal definitions of fair value. And behind those procedures stood the importers. In 1921, just after World War I, this idea became law with the Anti-Dumping Act and the emergency tariff. On paper, they protected American industries from unfair foreign competition. In practice, they opened the door for legal challenges to tariffs themselves. You didn't have to change the law, you just had to reinterpret it. By 1922, the Tariff Commission could recommend rate changes based on their research. By 1927, importers were winning lawsuits that changed how goods were classified, how value was calculated, and which countries got preferential treatment. Step by step, the weapon of tariffs was being converted into paperwork, not policy. And the true genius of the system? It looked like stability, like progress. Let the experts decide, they said. It's just trade. But underneath, it was the same old battle. National production versus global finance. Domestic wages versus cheap imports. Sovereignty versus access. And by the time the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was signed in 1930, raising duties on over 20,000 goods, the legal noose was already tightening. The system looked strong, but it was built on sand, a sand made of definitions, valuations, and court rulings. We built a fortress of tariffs, then quietly gave the keys to the clerks. The 1920s in America were not quiet. They roared. Factories ran day and night, radios crackled with jazz and investment tips. Wall Street grew faster than Main Street could understand. The war was over, the debts were owed to us now, and the dollar, backed by gold, was king. On the surface, tariffs were still strong. Congress had just passed the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922, a sharp hike in duties meant to shield American farmers and manufacturers from Europe's cheap post-war exports. A few years later, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930 would raise them even more. Politicians promised this was economic armor, and people believed them. Why wouldn't they? Industrial production was surging. U.S. Steel, General Motors, RCA, they weren't just American companies. They were becoming global. And the thinking went, if tariffs protect our industries, then our industries will protect our future. But here's where the illusion begins, because something else was growing faster than industry: debt. Not just personal debt, though that too, but international debt. After World War I, America became the world's largest creditor. European nations, crushed by war, borrowed heavily from U.S. banks. Then, to pay those debts, they needed to export to the U.S., but they couldn't because of tariffs. So they borrowed more from the same American banks, who knew exactly what they were doing. This was the game. Europe borrows dollars to buy American goods and pay old loans, while U.S. exporters and banks rake in profits. Tariffs made the goods expensive, which made the loans necessary. It was a loop. And as long as credit kept flowing, no one cared. Behind every tariff wall, a pipeline of credit ran straight under it. But here's the real trick. Tariffs were no longer about protection. They were about pricing power. Big American corporations weren't struggling against foreign competition. They were thriving because they had both sides of the trade. They sold at home with tariff protection. They lent abroad with interest. If imports came in cheap, fine, as long as the paperwork allowed adjustments and dumping duties to protect prices. If exports slowed down, no problem. The dollar was strong and loans kept demand alive. And the courts? They greased the gears. Between 1922 and 1929, a string of rulings redefined key terms in tariff law. What counted as fair market value? Could you challenge a customs official's judgment? Could an importer use the price in Belgium to fight a duty on a German product? These may sound like technicalities, but each one was a knife in the side of tariff power. Because once you can challenge how a tariff is calculated, you don't need to repeal it. You just reinterpret it. It's the same trick used today with environmental laws, labor standards, tax rules. You don't change the law, you change its enforcement. Or better, outsource it. By the late 1920s, the illusion was complete. Tariffs looked high on paper. Politicians claimed they were protecting workers. But in practice, the people writing the rules weren't elected. They were appointed. The Tariff Commission, the customs courts, the banking lawyers who found loopholes. And for a while, it worked. Capital kept flowing, stocks kept rising, factories kept humming. The numbers, GDP, exports, industrial output, looked like they would rise forever. But arithmetic doesn't lie. Debt was outpacing production. Courts were outpacing Congress. And the gold standard, the final anchor of global value, was being quietly undermined by the very credit it was supposed to restrain. We thought tariffs protected us, but they were already paper shields. It didn't begin with a crash. It began with a number no one could argue with. In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange lost over $14 billion in a single day. But that wasn't the real collapse. That was just the explosion. The collapse had already begun, in margins, in bank books, and in ledgers full of debt that could never be repaid. Because credit always outruns belief. And in the 1920s, belief in American protectionism, in tariffs, in walls, in national industry, had become untethered from the reality beneath it. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff passed in June 1930. It was supposed to be the Great Wall, the highest tariff schedule in U.S. history. Duties raised on more than 20,000 imported goods, protection for farmers, for industry, for the nation. But it arrived too late, like locking the vault after the bank's already been emptied. Because behind the scenes, America's trade enemies weren't just foreign nations, they were domestic courts. And one case in particular marked the turning point. U.S. versus Hanson Importing Co., 1930. It didn't involve tanks or oil. It involved women's fur coats. Hanson, a New York importer, challenged the way customs calculated duties on fur garments. According to law, duties were based on the foreign market value. But that value, said Hanson's lawyers, was being miscalculated. They claimed it violated their rights, and they won. The decision forced customs officials to accept the lowest value documented, not the average, not the intended sale price, which meant tariffs could be gamed, value could be claimed low, duties would follow. The tariff wall had a legal hole punched right through it. This was just the beginning. In the early 1930s, hundreds of similar cases flooded the U.S. Customs Court, and one by one, tariff definitions were softened. Comparable prices, usual selling conditions, cost of production. These weren't just words, they were weapons. And importers, backed by banks and trading firms, were using them to dismantle the system from the inside. Meanwhile, abroad, America's trading partners retaliated. Canada struck back with its own tariffs. France raised duties on over 3,000 American goods. Britain began favoring imperial trade blocs, the sterling area. Global trade shrank 66% between 1929 and 1934. Tariffs didn't cause the Great Depression, but they sure didn't stop it. Because here's the truth. The collapse wasn't about policy. It was about confidence. The market didn't care if tariffs were high or low. It cared whether they could be enforced. And once the courts began slicing up the tariff code, once importers could win refunds, dodge duties, and rewrite classifications, the illusion broke. The numbers no longer added up. The U.S. couldn't run high tariffs and maintain rising exports. It couldn't protect farmers and sustain global loans. It couldn't keep its gold standard and flood the world with credit. The math was impossible, and politics bowed to it. By 1934, Congress quietly passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, a soft-sounding law, but it gave the president, not Congress, the power to negotiate tariffs directly with other countries. Why? Because Congress had lost control of the process. The system was broken. The walls were already full of holes. The courts had made sure of that. So they flipped the model from tariffs to treaties, from national control to global negotiation. And the Tariff Commission? It stayed. But its role shifted from protector to analyst, from defender of American production to supplier of economic data for trade deals. The power was gone. It was a quiet coup. Tariffs, once the backbone of U.S. sovereignty, became a bargaining chip. And the hidden winners? Banks, who now got stable trade routes. Multinationals, who now got predictable access. And courts, who now held the technical power to interpret every line of trade law. The collapse wasn't loud. It was procedural. If you thought that story ended in the 1930s, it didn't. It just changed costume. Because when a system fails, power doesn't disappear. It moves. And after tariffs lost their teeth, trade policy didn't die. It metastasized. What used to be a blunt tool, 10% on wool, 30% on steel, became a network of invisible wires, bilateral agreements, arbitration courts, intellectual property clauses, rules of origin longer than novels. It all began with a soft promise in 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. Just a temporary framework, they said, a gentleman's agreement to avoid another trade war. But by 1995, GATT had become the World Trade Organization, and for the first time in human history, national tariff policy, the same weapon Congress once used to protect American jobs, was now subject to global arbitration. It sounded like peace. It was control. Because under the WTO, if a country imposes a tariff for health, for jobs, for national security, it can be sued, not in U.S. courts, in Geneva, by panels, by lawyers, by trade specialists who don't answer to voters. The same trick as in 1930. You don't ban tariffs, you make them technically reviewable. You don't repeal sovereignty, you make it conditional. And who benefits? Multinational companies that want uniform rules across borders, investment banks that hate uncertainty, creditors who can now enforce contracts against governments. Same architecture, new brand. And yes, this all came back in 2018. Donald Trump, a businessman who spent decades fighting regulations, walked into the White House and saw what no politician had said out loud since 1930, that the president could still impose tariffs using Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act if he claimed it was for national security. So he did. Steel, aluminum, solar panels, washing machines. Then, China. It wasn't just about trade. It was a challenge to the entire post-war system. The backlash was instant. Lawsuits flooded in. Trade partners retaliated. Economists screamed. But the courts, at first, upheld Trump's power. Then came Trans-Pacific Steel versus United States in 2022. A small ruling, but it cracked the foundation. The court argued that Trump's tariffs were invalid because they were implemented too late after the Commerce Department's report. Not because they were wrong, but because the process had deviated. Sound familiar? Just like in 1930, the courts weren't attacking tariffs. They were slicing them apart by procedure, killing the weapon by controlling its handle. And by 2025, the fight returned again. Trump, back in power, declared sweeping tariffs, 10% across the board. He invoked national security again. He bypassed the WTO. He threatened to withdraw from the entire system if the courts blocked him. But now the battlefield is different. Trade isn't about textiles or wheat. It's about data flows, intellectual property, supply chains, semiconductors. Tariffs aren't duties anymore. They're strategic tools, weapons of policy, not price. And yet, the same struggle remains. Who sets the rules? Is it Congress, the president, the courts, or unelected panels in foreign capitals? The illusion is that we live in a world of free trade. But in reality, trade is more regulated than ever, just not by you. And tariffs? They're still here. But their power depends on who gets to define them. What counts as fair value? Who determines national interest? and how fast the courts are willing to act. Because in a rules-based order, rules are weapons, and judges are generals. If this helped connect the dots from Smoot-Hawley to Section 232 to WTO lawsuits, let us know in the comments. Systems don't repeat history, they just rename it. If you're hearing this in 2025, know this: we've been here before. Not just in trade wars, not just in courtrooms, but at the edge of a system stretched beyond its promises. Back then, it was tariffs and gold. Now, it's data and debt. But the shape of collapse never really changes. It starts with numbers, too many claims on too little reality, too much leverage, too much dependence on systems no one elected, governed by rules no one understands. In 1930, the numbers said America could protect its industry and still lead global finance, that it could lend to the world while shielding its markets, that courts could refine the system without unraveling it. But arithmetic cannot be deceived. Today, the illusion is different, but the trap is the same. We believe in global order, in open trade, in smooth supply chains that deliver microchips like milk. But behind every deal is a clause. Behind every clause, a court. Behind every court, an unelected hand. And once again, the numbers don't lie. Trillions in leverage, record trade deficits, invisible flows of capital moving faster than laws can follow. So when leaders try to break the spell, when someone like Trump says, "We're taking back control," it's not just political, it's mathematical. Because deep down, everyone knows the system isn't working. The real question is, who gets to change it? The voter? The judge? The bank? The boardroom? We pretend trade is about prices, but it's always been about power. And power doesn't disappear. It centralizes. It flows uphill. Away from the farmer, the factory, the family business, toward the places where rules can be rewritten without consent. That's how tariffs died. Not because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient. They interfered with the illusion of infinite trade, infinite credit, infinite integration. But nature has limits. So do people. And when the numbers finally break the spell, the correction won't be polite. If this series showed you a side of history they don't teach in school, share it. Because once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. And you'll know what's coming when they tell you, it's just trade.